Everyone for coming. And I just want to welcome all of you to tonight's event. My name is Dr. Gary Fair, and I'm the Associate Vice President of Research and Graduate Studies at UFV. And as a result, the Peace and Reconciliation Center falls under my purview, and so I'm just absolutely excited about what we're doing in that center. So first of all, I want to acknowledge that the University of the Fraser Valley is situated on the unceded territory of the Stalo people. And I'm so fortunate to be able to live here and enjoy this land. I lived for 4 years in Ontario and couldn't wait to get back here. I just appreciate the landscape, and I appreciate the work that the Stalo people put into preserving that landscape so we can enjoy it. So PARC is a interdisciplinary research center, and it addresses really complex issues in partnership with our local stakeholders. And that really does distinguish it from a lot of other research centers. It examines conflict right from the geopolitical scale right down to the interpersonal. And this also makes it distinct, this breadth of issues that it looks at. And it's the first of its kind in British Columbia. So tonight, we're going to start with a 15 to 20 minute presentation by my colleague, Dr. Amanda McCormick, about the barriers to reporting victimization, after which we will move to a panel discussion with our guest panelists, who will be asked to speak a little bit about each of their organizations before we turn it over to the audience for an interactive panel discussion. So, Dr. Amanda McCormick is an associate professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of the Fraser Valley. She's a research associate with the Center for Public Safety and Criminal Justice Research and the commitment leader for the Peace and Reconciliation Center's Community of Practice in Domestic Violence Reduction. Her research interests include policing strategies, family violence, public safety issues, at-risk youth, and serious and violent young offenders, and problem gambling. She teaches courses on family violence, young offenders, mental health, in the criminal justice system, and research methods. Dr. McCormick has been a lead or co-investigator on over 30 research projects, has authored and co-authored more than 10 peer-reviewed publications and over 50 research reports. She has presented her work at academic conferences, symposia, and sessions of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women and Human Rights Council meetings. Dr. McCormick is also a member of the Abbotsford Mission Violence Against Women in Relationships Committee and the Abbotsford Mission Purple Lights Nights Committee. Welcome, Dr. McCormick.
All right. Thank you, everybody who's joining us here today. I'm very pleased to see you. And also we have guests online as well. So thank you for joining us. We are monitoring the chat if you have any comments or questions you'd like to add as we go. So I do have a presentation that I'm going to be starting off with today, but feel free, please, just to jump in, make this more of an interactive kind of conversation at this stage. I'll be talking a little bit about what we know from the research perspective on the barriers to reporting victimization before I introduce our panel, and then we'll engage in a bit of a conversation. So with that said, I'll get going with my side of the talk, and starting off with a very depressing statistic. So I don't know how many of you know this, but in Canada, every 2 days, a woman or girl is killed as a result of femicide. And so many of these are unfortunately the victims of an intimate partner homicide. So you may recognize some of these names: Roger and Jasbir Saran, Amber Cully, Mimi Cates, and Kamaljeet Sandhu. So these are just some of the people who have unfortunately lost their lives as a result of a domestic violence homicide. And of course, we know some of these just happened just recently in our communities. Every year in BC, approximately 10 people die as a result of intimate partner violence. Unfortunately, very few of those people have ever connected to the police, have ever reported their victimization before. So in the last coroner's inquest that we did, which goes back now a number of years to 2016, the statistics showed that only 1/3 of people who were killed in an intimate partner homicide had ever reported their victimization to the police. So what prevents people from reporting intimate partner violence to the police? And what can we do to increase the number of people who are coming forward and seeking help when they're in an abusive relationship? How can we support the people that we know, the people that we love, the people that we care for, whether they're our family members or friends or coworkers? How can we support them if we suspect or know that they're experiencing abuse? That is why we are here today, gathered here today and online as well. So we can identify what some of those barriers are that prevent people from reaching out for help. And we can talk about some of the options and some of the services and some of the barriers that exist and how we can try to reduce those barriers. So thank you again for joining us here in person and online to have this conversation. As I mentioned, I'm grateful to have some local service providers here and in the audience as well, who are here to answer some questions that you might have about why people don't come forward and what we can do to increase that. But before that, I also just want to acknowledge that the month of October is known as Purple Lights Nights. It's domestic violence awareness. And so we have a number of activities and initiatives that we're engaging in throughout the month of October. We're going to the farmers markets, both in Abbotsford and Mission. We're going to the hockey game. Some of our lucky community members get to go to the hockey game. And we're doing this event here tonight, and we're doing other outreach and speaking about domestic violence in our communities. As you came in today, you saw our table outside. We have a number of resources there that I encourage you to pick up, whether you're a student and looking for resources at UFV, or if you're a community member needing to know where to go, where to receive help. We've got resources, pamphlets, we've got pins you can pick up, stickers. Please stop by the table and ask our experts questions, and feel free to pick up some of our materials there. We are, of course, encouraging people to wear purple for the month of October. We're asking businesses to put up purple lights in recognition of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. But really what we're trying to do is have the conversation. We want to talk about domestic violence in our communities. We want people to feel comfortable coming forward and asking these important questions. And we want to make those connections to services happen. So to start off, just so that everybody's familiar, I'm going to talk about some of the barriers that exist according to the research in Canada and also the research we've done locally in Abbotsford. But first of all, it is important that we define what we are talking about. And so this is the lecture part of the conversation. There we go. Sorry, let's move that forward. All right, so we're going to start off with a definition. Because actually some of the research identifies that some of the barriers to reporting intimate partner victimization come from not knowing what abuse looks like. It's just not recognized by some people who are experiencing an abusive relationship. So it's important that we understand what this might look like. And there are many, many different types of intimate partner violence. It's often defined as physical, sexual, psychological, even financial abuse by a current or former intimate partner. So this could be somebody who you are dating, somebody who you were living with or married to, even somebody that you were formerly married to, but you are no longer in that intimate partner relationship with them. These are all encompassed under the definition. So some of these forms of abuse that we're going to be talking about today, as I mentioned, are not easily recognized as a form of violence. But it's important that we talk about what happens in these relationships so that people know that what the signs of abuse are, and again, when they should be coming forward and asking for help. So in Canada, and this is a shocking statistic, Statistics Canada estimates that about 44% of women aged 15 and older who have ever been in an intimate partner relationship have experienced at least one form of intimate partner violence, and that is too high of a number. Now, the most common form of violence when we're talking about what happens in terms of community-based research is psychological forms of abuse. And so this is when one partner attacks the other partner emotionally, verbally, using tricks like gaslighting to attack people's identity, to tear down their self-esteem through lies, threats, intimidation, name-calling, other types of insulting or belittling comments. Unfortunately, again, psychological abuse is the most common occurring at the community level, but it's also one of the forms of abuse that people don't recognize as being abuse. And they don't recognize that this is something that they can seek help for. Similarly, we're now recognizing a new form of abuse, some of you will know this, known as coercive control. So research that we've actually done here in Abbotsford, students and with community members, suggests that among people who are experiencing intimate partner violence, nearly half or more, actually, depending on the sample you're looking at, they have experienced different forms of coercive controlling behaviors within their abusive relationships. So it is actually a very common thing to have happen. So just so everyone's familiar with what that means, it's a pattern of conduct where the abuser seeks to isolate, intimidate, and manipulate the victim using often psychological tactics, but even sometimes physical or sexual violence, and it forces the person to comply with the abuser's demands. A person who coercively controls their intimate partner might limit who they're allowed to talk to, They might prevent them from working or limit who they're allowed or where they're allowed to work. They might control what that person wears, how they do their hair. These are all signs that somebody's being coercively controlled by a partner who is seeking to use power and control to dominate that relationship. Over time, through these tactics, and this does tend to stretch out over a period of many years of abuse as it escalates and gets more severe, over time, they break that person down to the point where they've lost their identity, they've lost their confidence, they've lost their self-esteem. And they essentially, through the fear of it, prevent them from seeking help, prevent them from reaching out, because pushing back against a coercive controlling partner can actually trigger, in some cases, a violent reaction. So we are now starting to understand just how dangerous coercive control is in an intimate partner relationship and how common it is. We're starting to understand the increased risks for life safety that it poses when an intimate partner is using controlling tactics. And so in recognition of this, other countries like the UK and Australia, they've actually criminalized coercive controlling behaviors. We've had that conversation begun in Canada, but we have not yet made any laws to criminalize coercive controlling behavior. And so, of course, when a person is experiencing this form of abuse, they may not understand that they're being abused, but even if they do, they don't necessarily know that they can go to the police and that they can report the abuse that they're experiencing, because it may not actually form a criminal, it may not be part of our criminal code. And so they may not believe that there's anything that the police can or will do in response to that. Some forms of psychological violence, threats again, if you make a threat to harm the victim, their loved ones, even their pets, these are things that are in the criminal code. But unfortunately, many other forms of abuse are not yet recognized in that way. So when a survivor of abuse does understand that they're being abused psychologically, they, again, tend not to reach out to the police. And so this is one of the conversations we're trying to have today, to open up this level of awareness and knowledge that if you're in a relationship where these tactics are being used, it's possibly going to escalate into a more dangerous situation. And so we're encouraging people to reach out to the various services and start that communication. Likewise, another form of intimate partner violence that is common here among survivors of intimate partner violence is stalking. And actually, stalking in Canada is not actually a legal term. We don't have stalking in Canada. It's defined as criminal harassment or harassing communications. But research with community members in Abbotsford that we've done, as well as the students here at UFV who we've surveyed, has found that, again, amongst those that have experienced intimate partner violence, almost half of them reported various forms of being stalked or harassed by a current or former intimate partner. So it's actually incredibly common amongst this population. Now, examples of this might include when somebody is persistently calling you or messaging you, refusing to give up, trying to connect with you or to communicate with you. Even though you've told them to stop, this behavior is unwanted, they continue to do so. They might also show up unexpectedly, places where you don't expect them to be, like the grocery store, your work, your school. These are forms of harassment and stalking. We've also heard more recently, as technology develops more rapidly, there's more ways to track people using things like GPS technology and air tags. So I'm sure you've heard these stories in the news about people finding air tags under their vehicles. And so it's another form of harassment in Canada. So unfortunately, sometimes when a person is experiencing this form of abuse, again, they don't necessarily see it as something that the police can or will do something about. They might interpret it as just a nuisance behavior, an annoying behavior. However, when it happens in the context of a coercive controlling relationship, or when the person is doing it out of a desire for revenge, or they're angry at the survivor, in that case, it has the potential to escalate again into a dangerous, potentially violent situation. But still, victims may not interpret this as being a form of criminal behavior, and they may not believe that there's anything that the police can do in these cases, and so they may not come forward. When they do come forward with a criminal harassment complaint, it's unfortunately one of the types of intimate partner violence, according to our research, that's least likely to result in a criminal charge being recommended against the perpetrator, for a number of different reasons. One being that it requires a pattern of behavior. So the first time you report it may not be enough to have the case, the evidence that you need. And it's also one of the most complicated types of abuse to actually collect the evidence for in support of a criminal charge. And so that can be a deterrence for people to report that. Now, the form of intimate partner violence that is most likely to be reported to the police is physical victimization. According to the police data that we've looked at, the types of offenses that are most likely reported to the police are what the criminal code would title as a simple assault. So these are things like whether somebody might be pushed or slapped, for example. Those are the most common forms that are reported to the police. We do, of course, see some more severe forms of physical assault being reported. We're understanding increasingly now the number of survivors of intimate partner violence who have sustained a brain injury as a result of being hit in the head, having their head hit into a wall, for example, having their head hit with an object, and strangulation. We're now recognizing that strangulation is actually much more common than we knew it was in intimate partner abusive relationships. And unfortunately, it has the potential for both short and long-term health and mental health consequences for the survivor of the strangulation. So again, even though these are more physical forms of violence, we don't see 100% reporting amongst those people that are experiencing it. Even further, they won't seek medical care in many cases. We know that survivors will not go to the hospital. They will deny access to medical services for a good number of reasons. But of course, this puts them at greater risk of both the short-term and the long-term physical as well as psychological effects. Now, some of the reasons they might not report this more serious form of victimization is because they fear the retaliation from the abuser. They fear if they tell someone, if they start that conversation, their abuser is potentially going to hurt them even worse going forward because now they have reported them, it threatens their control in the relationship, and it risks the involvement of the legal system. And so they fear triggering that greater retaliation. Of course, we know that people also worry about how reporting victimization to the police might affect their families. Not all people in an abusive relationship want to end that abusive relationship. They want to end the abuse, but they don't necessarily want to end the relationship itself. And they might fear that having to come forward and make a report might require them to end that relationship. When you have children, right, when you have extended family members who are part of this dynamic, it becomes very complicated. You can't just necessarily walk away from that relationship. And so the fear of what will happen to the family, the fear of what will happen to the children, these are all very good reasons why people don't come forward to report their abuse. There's also uncertainty about what will happen next. Once I involve the police, what's going to happen? What am I going to be required to do? And so we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later tonight. When people do report being physically abused to the police, the research, again, in Canada and the work that we've done here in Abbotsford suggests that people might wait until it's sort of the last resort for them because they fear that the abuser will hurt or seriously hurt or kill them. But unfortunately, once they do make that report, the lack of control that they have over what happens next frustrates some people because they want the violence to stop, but again, they don't necessarily want the relationship to have to end. And so there are ways that we can work with families in order to not necessarily make that outcome have to happen. But at the front end, people don't always know that, and it might prevent them from reaching out to the police. As we'll talk about in a little bit when we get to our panel conversation, police in British Columbia are required to make an arrest and to recommend charges whenever there's evidence that an offense has occurred. And so this sometimes deters people when they know that this is going to be the next step. So intimate partner violence, it occurs in all populations, right? It's not just something that we see in females, for example. Men can be victims too. We know there are transgender or non-binary victims. We know that it occurs in all cultures, all socioeconomic statuses. It occurs at all ages as well. It's not just something that we see in certain groups of people. None of us are immune to ever having this in our life. That said, there are some groups that might experience more unique barriers to coming forward and reporting to the police. So I'm just going to highlight a few of those that might exist. Now, one of the populations that I haven't mentioned yet in the statistics are Indigenous peoples. There is a great deal of variability depending on the research, the communities that are being researched and how the research is being conducted. But generally speaking, as a group, Statistics Canada data suggests that Indigenous peoples, and particularly Indigenous women, are at least 2 to 3 times more likely to experience intimate partner violence. Beyond that, they are also more likely to experience the more severe forms of sexual violence and strangulation. They're more likely to report being injured, and they're more likely to report being fearful that their partner will kill them. So a major reason for some of these trends, as we know, or we should know at this stage, are the ongoing effects of colonization. As the trauma from residential schools, the overextension historically of the child welfare system into Indigenous families, it has left its mark on these peoples. It's now passed down from one generation to the next. It is extremely oversimplifying the issue, but a common response to trauma, not just amongst people who are Indigenous, but amongst anyone who's been exposed to trauma, is to turn to things like substances, like alcohol, for example, because it dulls those memories, it dulls the pain. And of course, we know that that then increases the risk that violence is going to occur. We're also, of course, talking about racist and discriminatory practices that go back many generations. And so unfortunately, many Indigenous children themselves may have been raised in homes where they were exposed to intimate partner violence within the families, because this is now multiple cycles where this has occurred. And so that unfortunately exposes them to unhealthy relationship models, which is what they then base their own future relationships on. And so we see that further perpetuation of cycles of abuse. Now, there are some unique barriers to reporting victimization amongst Indigenous populations. Some of this, again, goes back to colonization and the practices like residential schools. As we should have learned in school, the RCMP was basically tasked with taking children away from their families and taking them to the residential schools. And as I mentioned, the statistics show that over the years, we've had an overrepresentation of child welfare involvement amongst Indigenous families, particularly during the 60s scoop, where many of these children were seized from their families and put into white Anglo-Saxon homes. So as you can imagine, there's a lack of trust that exists between the Indigenous populations and systems like the criminal justice system. And the result of that is, again, Indigenous survivors of violence may only be willing to call the police if they're in that fearful moment of that person's going to kill me. They may not be otherwise willing to involve them. And even then, we know that many Indigenous people today have had prior negative interactions with police, whether it's racist or stigmatic. And so they may not be willing to call in the police because they might fear how that response is going to affect them or even their partner. And so they don't reach out, they don't call out for that connection. Now, we are thankfully starting to break down those barriers. We are starting to rebuild those relationships, and we are starting to see improvements in the relationships between our Indigenous populations and agencies like the police. But of course, there's still a substantial amount of work that needs to be done there. I just want to focus on one other group in particular, and of course, it's the group of people that may experience unique barriers to reporting victimization due to things like language barriers or being a recent immigrant or a refugee to the area. So Abbotsford in particular has a very large South Asian population. And so the research that's been conducted with this population until recently has been very, very limited. It's a very hard to reach population, not really open to speaking about these experiences. But over the last few years, we've actually seen a number of research studies be conducted across Canada with South Asian women, and we've done some of our own research here in Abbotsford as well. And so we're starting to identify what some of those more unique barriers might be that are experienced by South Asian women. So for example, some research has found that South Asian women in Canada are not only victimized by their intimate partner, but often by other members of the family as well. So their spouse might be abusing them, but so might their parents-in-law, so might their sisters-in-law, for example. They may all be living in a single home together as well, and so they can't get away from the abuse that is happening. If the victim attempts to report the victimization, they might also be threatened by these members of the family, threatened that their children will be taken away from them, threatened that they'll be deported. They might be threatened with violence as well. They'll be told that reporting this abuse, which they will not define as abuse, but reporting it and involving the police will bring shame to the family and shame them in the eyes of God. And so this is a major deterrent to reporting victimization. We also know, especially if they're recent immigrants, that they might have a limited social network and they're not necessarily familiar with the laws in Canada. And so they don't know who they can trust. Some of the research has unfortunately shown that victims, South Asian victims of intimate partner violence who reach out to who they suspect are trusted community members to talk about what they're going through and to ask for help, that trusted community member then reports back to the family about what they were told. And so they're reaching out for support, and what they're getting is further traumatization, further abuse that's happening. And so they're not successfully connected into the services. And so add to all this, of course, the complexities of language and having to make a report to an English-speaking officer when you're not necessarily comfortable with that language. In some cases, that might require an interpreter being brought in, which in some cases involves a family member. And so the victim may not even be sure that the story that they're giving is being accurately told to that responding officer. So this is just some of the barriers that we're starting to identify, and they're very complicated issues to try to break down, but thankfully the research is starting in that area. Now, just briefly, these are just two of the major groups, but there are countless other groups that might experience unique barriers to reporting victimization. For example, people with disabilities. So people with intellectual or physical disabilities may not have the means to report the victimization. Their abuser might also be their caretaker, and so reporting them to the police raises questions about who will care for their needs. And they may be concerned about whether they'll be able to stay in their home, for example, or if they'll have to be placed elsewhere for care. We also know, as I mentioned earlier, there are male victims of violence, many of whom do not report their victimization to the police. They fear that they will not be believed by the police officer. There's a fear that they will be made fun of as well. Why didn't you stand up for yourself? That kind of thing. There's also a fear of being arrested. Even though they were the victim calling the police, there is a fear that they will be arrested as the perpetrator of that violence. And so they're very unlikely to reach out. People who identify as LGBTQ+ might not report intimate partner violence. Again, the fear of stigma when the police officer responds. There's some research that suggests that when the police do attend an intimate partner violence call, that they may not identify as being an intimate partner. They might identify as being roommates to avoid that stigmatic reaction from the officer. And so we are probably actually undercounting how much violence is going on in these communities. We also know that a very unique barrier to reporting is that the threat that your abuser is going to disclose your gender identity or your sexual orientation, especially if you haven't come out to your family or to your coworkers, for example. And so that is a very real threat that prevents some people from coming forward. And lastly, people who live in rural populations, again, are very isolated, may not have access to services. There's research showing that in rural communities, there may not be access to a shelter or a transition home for 50 kilometers or more. And so it's very difficult then to try to exit these relationships and access the services and the resources. Hopefully we made some grounds with that during COVID, but certainly there are still many, many barriers to trying to support victims who come from these more rural communities. So I could literally go on for hours. My students in the room know that, but I won't. This is just highlighting some of the main areas, some of the main barriers that we know exist. What I want to just leave you with here is that the last general social survey victimization study that was done found that of those who experienced intimate partner violence in the past 5 years, only 19% of them reported that to the police. So that is a terrible statistic. I mean, part of it comes down to the different forms of victimization that's being experienced, but people don't report because, again, they don't know that it's abuse necessarily. They don't think that the police can or will do anything about it. They fear whether or not they'll be believed. They don't want to bother anybody. Students, we ask them about some barriers. They don't want other people knowing what's going on. They don't want their family to know. I mean, there's so many different barriers, but 19% is a statistic that we can definitely improve going forward. And so that's why we're here today, right? We're talking about some of these barriers. I've just highlighted some of the ones that exist in the literature. But what we're going to do for the remaining time that we have here today is open up that conversation. I'm going to introduce our panelists in just a moment, and then I've asked them each to speak a little bit about their programs, the work that they do, and then we're going to turn it over to you guys. And I really do want this to be quite an interactive discussion. So please feel free to ask your questions. Please feel free to add your comments as well if you'd like to engage in the conversation that way. We do have our online audience, so please, if you would like to ask some questions, we've got Brianna's monitoring the chat, and so she'll be taking those questions down. Let's ask the questions that you always wanted to know the answer to, but never had the opportunity to actually ask. Please go ahead and do that. So we'll do that in about 10 or so minutes, but first I'm going to turn it over to our panel so they can take over the conversation. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction to everybody, and then I'll ask each of you to speak. So we'll start here. We've got Detective Lisa Faria. Detective Faria has been a police officer with the Abbotsford Police Department for over 25 years. She's worked in patrol, intelligence, property crime, major crime, and the intimate partner violence unit. Detective Faria has considerable experience in witness management and investigating reports of sexual assaults and relationship violence offenses. She's currently assigned to the Intimate Partner Violence Unit, which is a unit that is co-located with 2 Abbotsford Police Department detectives, 2 MCFD social workers, and 2 specialized victim service workers from Archway Community Services. The IPVU takes the highest risk files in Abbotsford, and they take a wraparound approach to supporting clients and holding offenders accountable, which I will be asking Lisa in just a few minutes to speak about in a little bit more depth. Next, we have Luke Vinder. Luke Vinder Ojala has been working in the anti-violence sector for over 20 years. Most of her experience has been with the Abbotsford and Mission Specialized Victim Assistance Program, or SBAP, first as a frontline staff and later as a program supervisor. She first became involved in the anti-violence sector in 1992 as a practicum student, where she realized how difficult and challenging it was for South Asian women to seek help. In 1993, she assisted in writing a successful proposal to receive funding for Indo-Canadian Victim Assistance Program, which still exists today under the label of Multicultural Victim Assistance Program. Luke Vinder has been involved in a number of different smaller projects and events in Abbotsford to create awareness amongst community partners and the community at large. In 2010, she took part in reviewing the RCMP's domestic violence policy, which was implemented later that year. And around the same time, she assisted in creating the domestic violence unit, now the IPVU in Abbotsford, which again is a partnership between the Abbotsford Police Department and MCFD. Lukhvinder is also a graduate of UFV with a BA in criminal justice. Now we have Lucky Verk. Lucky has been employed with the SARA for Women's Society since 2009. She's a program manager for the outreach program. And she's also the chair of our Violence Against Women in Intimate Relationships Committee and an active Purple Lights Nights committee member. Lucky is passionate about supporting women and their dependent children, including unhoused women living with HIV, using and supporting planning for harm reduction and operations. Lucky is also a graduate of UFV as well, also from a BA in criminal justice and a minor in sociology. So we are thrilled to have you all here today. I'm going to start with directing a question to Detective Lisa Faria. So one of the reasons that I mentioned about why intimate partner violence isn't reported to the police is that the victim or the survivor isn't clear on what's going to happen once the police respond to that call. So can you tell us a little bit about how the police typically respond to these calls and why they do what they do?
Yeah, so there's sort of two answers to that because there's two major scenarios that happen. It's either an emergent situation where 911 has been called and the police need to get there right away to ensure that people are safe. The other alternative that happens is if people are calling into the police department or coming to the police station and making a report when things are stable. So maybe I'll just explain. So if we are, the police are responding to a 911 call, what will happen is they will come to wherever the location is where this incident is occurring. And the first thing that they will do is they will make sure that everybody is safe. So that may require that an arrest is made and somebody is restrained. And it may be that the police are separating the parties and speaking to them individually to figure out what's going on. The police will look for evidence. They will look for injuries to see if anybody's obviously hurt. And of course, they'll transition to having medical care. That will happen before they start doing further investigation. From there, they will take a statement and they will decide whether or not somebody needs to be arrested. If that's the case, they will and they must arrest, as Dr. McCormick alluded to earlier. They must arrest if there's evidence that these people are in an intimate relationship and someone has assaulted the other person or some other sort of criminal offense has occurred. And then from there, the person who's been arrested will be taken back to the police station, and then there'll be some more interaction with the victim. And from there, like maybe they'll take some photographs of injuries, maybe they'll take some photographs of if there's been a kerfuffle in the room, some damage to the walls, that sort of thing. And they will maybe look at devices, like maybe there's harassment that has happened, or maybe there's been some threats that have occurred over the telephone, the cell phone. So they may look at that type of evidence as well. And then afterwards, typically the police, they will do a couple of things. The first one being that they will have a conversation with the victim about the history. What is the history of relationship? What are the other things that are happening? So we can get a full idea of what's going on, which is very important to Crown Counsel later when they're looking at the full scenario and trying to make some decisions on bail or what sort of conditions should be imposed to ensure that everybody's safe. The other thing that's done that's a very important role of the police in that very critical time is they do safety planning. So they want to make sure that there's a plan in place that this victim, and maybe there's children or elderly people also in the home, that everybody's safe. So they go through that and ensure that things are taken care of. And then going back over to the accused, the accused has been brought to the police station. They will be booked in, fingerprinted and photographed, and they will stay in police cells. And then what will happen is, in the meantime, the police have created a report to Crown Counsel, and they have submitted the report for Abbotsford, in our case, Abbotsford Crown Counsel, to look at what the evidence is, what's been reported. And then from there, Crown Counsel will make a decision whether or not they feel that charges are substantiated and they should move ahead with pursuing charges of assault or threatening or whatever the case may be. And if that's the case, they will swear in information at the courthouse, and then there'll be an appearance in court, and most likely there will be no contact conditions and some other things that will happen if they are released. Now, Crown Council may decide that for a number of reasons that person needs to be held in custody. So it's really hard to know. It's a case-by-case basis based on history, also based on circumstances of that event. The last thing I'll just say about that is if somebody's coming into the police station and they're coming in and they're safe and the accused doesn't know that they're making a report and they're coming in, they're stable, or they're calling in saying he lives in another place, he doesn't know I'm calling, and the police come to his or her home to take that report, the arrest is not necessarily going to happen that quickly because it's not critical for safety. So the police may take a little bit longer for an arrest to be made and make sure that all of those things are taken care of.
Thank you. Very helpful overview. Number of questions that I'm going to follow up with in a little bit. And please ask your questions to Lisa as well and online. But first, I'm just going to move over to Lukvinder so we can hear a little bit about the community side of things. So we know that people don't always report victimization to the police, but they might talk to their friends, they might talk to their families, and they might reach out to community-based programs as well. We have both the police-based victim services and we have community-based victim services. And so Lukvinder, maybe you can talk a little bit about what the Specialized Victim Assistance Program does. So maybe how people come to you and how you support them.
Sure. So the Specialized Victim Service programs came about, I think, in the late 80s and 90s. And the main reason that those programs were funded by the government was for that purpose, that people were not reporting but needed help. So community-based victim services, a person can come into our agency and say, you know, I have an issue at home, I need help, but I don't want the police involved at this point. So then we do similar to what the police do. We talk to them, get some information, get a little bit of the history, and to determine what supports that they need on that unreported case, right? So it could be doing safety planning, because if they're still living in the home, we want to make sure that they're safe as much as they can be. So we do safety planning, giving them safety tips. If they're ready to maybe leave the relationship and they just want some information about that, then we talk about, okay, look at their financial situation, look at their family support, family friend support. Do they have access to any of those support that they might need? What about, you know, do they have children? Because then the custody and access and support through family court. So then we talk about support that they might need for family court. So there's a lot. It again depends on the situation, but we look at each person's situation and look at what they need. If they're in the relationship or they're planning to leave, and it varies. Like sometimes we've had cases where the person says, I know everything that I need to do. I have things in place. I just need to get counseling at this point. So then that's what we'll focus on. So we really focus on what they need. But the other thing that we do talk about is the option of reporting as well. Because like you said, sometimes they're not familiar with that process and they're not sure, you know, what to expect if they did call the police. They want to know before they do that. So we get those situations as well. But you covered a lot of the reasons for not reporting. We hear all of those, the barriers that you talked about. We hear them all the time in all of our files, whether they're reported or unreported, the challenges that they face in making those decisions, because at the end of the day, this is a situation that involves a family, and sometimes it involves this extended family. And when you talked about the South Asian women, sometimes they don't report because they have no supports here. He is her only support, and maybe his family, right? And her family's all back home. And a lot of times they don't share that information with their family because often they say, well, what are they going to do? They are so far away. Or they share and their family is not being supportive. They're just saying, you know, he'll change, you know, just stay, he'll change. So sometimes they don't have that support. So they're isolated as well.
Thank you. I think it's important to point out as well that both your program and Lucky's program provide services in Punjabi as well for people that do have that language barrier. Did you want to ask a question? Yeah.
Because I know you can walk into the police station. Because you sounded like you're talking about, it's like, can you walk in and then as you extend, you make appointments to then discuss the other things?
Yeah, for sure. We, with our program in Abbotsford, there's usually somebody in our office. We have 4 or 5 staff that work at the main office. So the way we have it, somebody's always at the office. So if somebody comes into our agency, because we're a multi-service agency with over 90 programs, so victim services being one, let's say if we weren't there, they might find someone else for you to talk to and then make the referral to us. But people can definitely walk in, they can call. If they're not ready to walk into a place, they can call. So I get those calls quite often because my direct line is out there. And that's where they can get the information over the phone. Because sometimes when they're still living in the situation, if they're still with their partner, they can't take the information back with them, like physical, like safety plan or safety tips. And so they just want to get the information.
And one last, is there funding based? So to sit down with you, you have to have under a certain amount of money?
No. So our program, they specialize victim assistance, or they're also known as community-based victim services in other communities, same program. They're funded by the government. So there's no fee, there's no income base at all. If you need help, you just call. And if let's say somebody comes into our program and maybe it's not a case that we would deal with, but maybe they are a victim of something else that they need help with. Because sometimes people have a family member that's abusing, an extended distant family member, then we connect them with police victim services perhaps, or other resources in the community. But there's no fee, no charge for our services at all. And there's no wait list with our program, because right now I know that a lot of resources are stretched to the max. Currently with the specialized program, we don't have a wait list.
Great questions. Thank you. And if you haven't stopped at our tables outside, make sure to do that because we have a number of different brochures, resources. We've got pamphlets for Archway and for SARA. We've got cards with contact information. And we have an infographic out there based on the student survey results, but it also has a number of the different community programs on there and their contact information.
I can add one more thing. The other thing that we do now with technology, our program email address is out there. You can find it on Archway website. We can link to our page, and people sometimes ask questions via email as well.
And actually that reminded me too, we also have with our resources outside, there is a QR code you can scan with your phone. And what it will do is actually pop up on your phone the different resources and services that are available in Abbotsford admission. So you don't have to take the physical copy with you. And in the past, we've also had these really cool little lipstick tubes that had information available in them as well. So just different ways of getting information out to people. So please definitely stop by outside. I'd just like to introduce Lucky again and just have her speak for a few minutes before we open up for our more interactive conversation. Lucky, finding safe housing is an issue, right? It's an issue. It's always been an issue. It became even more of an issue during COVID-19 pandemic. And so survivors who are fleeing an abusive relationship may not know where they can go if they're leaving their home, they're leaving their comforts. They don't know necessarily where they can find emergency shelter. When do they access a transition home? So can you maybe talk a little bit about some of the work that SARA provides in this area?
Sure. So SARA for Women has been around for many, many years. I will say around 30 years, but I joined my profession in 2009. And what SARA stands for is support, acceptance, resources, and action. And we provide services free of cost to all ages, to, it could come from any background, cultural, social, socioeconomic, and religious backgrounds. And what we have is we have safe housing for women when they are either experiencing domestic violence or they are at the risk of homelessness. So what they can do is we have our numbers available. It's free and confidential. So we would do a screening. They can call. We have one in Abbotsford and one in Mission. So those are our safe houses. And there are staff there that will help the women navigate resources available to them. Because when women are planning to leave, their fear is, I'm not going to get a place to stay. How am I going to pay, for my stay? So it's free of cost up to 30 days. We can extend it. It depends on the situation. And the workers inside will help them find housing. So to get into stable housing, and these days, affordable housing is an issue, but we have a housing worker that works with them that can help them, say, okay, let's help you with your finances first. Let's help you get with, income assistance if that's going to be the source of finance. And then we also have second stage housing, which is like Santa Rosa and Mission. And then we have Christine Lamb residence in Abbotsford. Again, there is an application process, but those two houses are subsidized rent. So it's really affordable, depends on your income, 33% of your income. And they have outreach workers there that will help navigate all the resources available to the women. They do daily check-ins with them, see what they need. Is it the food bank you need to be connected with? Oh, do you need to make a report to the police? So the workers in there will help them with that. We also have a Penny's Place, which is a program for low barrier housing program for up to 6 women who can stay there that are active in their addictions. So we have support available to those women as well. So there's support in housing, safe housing available to all women. If we don't have space, because that has been an issue, they're all at capacity usually, but we'll help them get into some other safe housing in another community. If it's Chilliwack, we'll call Chilliwack, like at Davis, right? Ishtar, Options. There's so many other transition houses available that we will help them connect with. And the services, I'll just also elaborate on that a little bit. So and when we have an office in Abbotsford and in Mission, so women are welcome to walk in at any time, 9 to 5 both, the head office and the one in Abbotsford. And we have an outreach team and a counseling team that are available. The outreach team, so basically when a woman walks in, they'll, if we don't have an outreach worker available at that time, the admin will take their name and number down. We can also be reached by email, and then an outreach worker will do their intake form and see what the woman needs. Is it finances, support with finances? Is it housing? Is it with, they have a care team meeting with the Ministry of Children and Families, right? So we want the woman, they also have, women always have a fear, well, if I report to you, I'm having violence in my house, I have children. We want to work with the woman because we also work very closely with our community partners. We're all in it together to provide support and safety for the women and the children. And we will, work with the women to say, what can we do to support you so that your children are safe, right? So we have a great relationship with that department as well, and with, the vendor, with family court, they kind of look after the criminal process with the clients, and we look after the family court system. Like going into court, like for acts, for child support, for parenting time, for all kinds, that's very intense for a woman who, and especially if they're new to the country, we have the languages available to help women with the language barrier part, and the outreach team will support them. And our counseling team, we have the Peace Program for children, that needs support with counseling, and wonderful counselors that work with the women, again, free of cost. There is a wait list for the counseling, but we are, hiring all the time to kind of navigate through that quicker. And then we also have legal booth, which is available for the women, because, having support with child support or child custody, guardianship now it's called, does become an issue. So we have legal booth that can help with that. We'll help the women connect with legal aid so that there's support with the legal side of aspect of things. We have pregnancy outreach program as well to help the moms that are expecting. And we also have Frania, which is our workforce training we provide the women who are looking to get into the workplace.
Amazing. Yeah, it's fantastic to hear. And I bet you didn't know about a lot of these resources. So this is why we're here today, is to hear about what we can do to support people and give them what they need, whether it's to end the relationship or if they want to remain in that relationship, to address what's going on there that's causing the violence. So thank you to each of you for this beginning conversation. I do want to open it up now so we can talk, we can ask our questions. I know that there's a few comments coming in online as well. So please, this is your opportunity to ask some questions to our experts here. What did you want to know that you haven't had a chance to ask before? Brianna, do you have anything from the online group? Excellent. What are the signs of an abusive relationship? So what do you tell people to look out for?
I would say we look, we're asking the woman, like, is there any firearms in the house? That's one question that we also ask in the intake. Is there any bizarre behavior going on? Are you being isolated? Like, are you able to, connect with someone if you need the support, right? Or are you, signs of abuse could also be, you're not allowed to go to attend an event or a social gathering, or you're not allowed to go to school for your education, that's also a red flag, right? And socializing with friends, even if it means to go for a coffee, financially, right? Not being able to go buy something without his permission is also a form of abuse. And
Yeah, and isolating you from your family, saying, well, your family's always interfering, so I don't want you connecting with your family. And like Lucky said, not being able to go at your free will to wherever you want to. Questioning when you come home. If you're a few minutes late, making a huge issue of why you're late. Dinner's not ready. So there's a big incident because the dinner wasn't quite ready. There's a lot of times women don't realize it, like when you were speaking about the research. There's a book that it's called When Love Hurts. And if you give that book to a lot of our clients, when they read it, they often say, wow, this feels like this is my story. And I've heard that from in South Asian women as well, when we go through the signs and they're like, this is exactly what was happening to me. So there's a lot of different signs, but like I said, you don't always recognize them. The clients don't recognize. It could be the emotional abuse, the psychological abuse, and with the physical abuse, the bruises and things go away, but the psychological abuse stays, right?
There's actually research that says that like you mentioned, the physical abuse, obviously it hurts in the moment, but many survivors of intimate partner violence have said that the psychological abuse is worse because it tears you down. It changes who you are as a person. Right? It affects your self-esteem. Yeah. But these are things that people don't know are actually abuse in some cases, especially if you've been brought up in a home where there are unhealthy relationships occurring. This is what you've learned, how we interact with others. You might have been, brought up by a parent who verbally insulted you on a regular basis. So people don't always think that these are necessarily forms of abuse, but in fact they are.
And I always suggest, like, even going online and looking at the domestic cycle of abuse. Women, when they look at that and read that, they're like, oh, I didn't know this was abuse. So When Love Hurts book is really good book. And then the resources online, the domestic violence cycle of abuse.
Yeah, we have actually a handout of the power and control wheel. And for those of you online, if you Google the power and control wheel, there are some excellent examples there that show how abusers use different tactics. So it's not always the physical or the sexual abuse that's happening, but it's the intimidation tactics, manipulation, using your children against you in some cases as well. It's all part of a bigger, larger pattern of conduct that is used to dominate and control over the victim. So Google the cycle, and you'll learn a little bit more about what those different signs might look like. Yes.
When Love Hurts puts a great language to, I didn't know that's what it was, but so when you have psychological abuse, so you were talking about criminal harassment or the harassment here, we don't have a language for it, but psychological abuse has now gone into the legal system and it's relatively new. But when you're going into the court system, then you speak to why people don't report. So I don't know if this was be a police question, but it's like, how can you document psychological abuse, because it's really just not bad enough in the eyes of a judge. And so when you are not protected from that abuse, because they're like, well, you didn't get bruised, you didn't get beaten, you didn't get this, how can you to keep standing up to that? So what works for evidence? Does that make sense of a question?
There might be a lawyer in the room.
Feel free to join us.
Maybe I'll try answering that. So it is very difficult. This is my professional experience. That is a very difficult thing. And what I would encourage people to do is to speak to the police and tell the police, show the police what you have. If it's all verbal, there's no record of that, right? So that's super difficult. That's a tough one. If you have that in emails or texts, you know, having that available for the police to review, and potentially if there were a charge to be forwarded, that could be disclosed to Crown Counsel to help them make their decision. But yes, it is difficult.
I think when often when an incident is proceeding to court, there's either an assault or threats, and then there's that whole everything that happened. So in court, they do mention a lot of what happened that day, maybe in an argument, and usually they're put down the abuse, the emotional abuse comes up as a whole case as a whole, right? But they're focused on the assault that happened. Yeah.
So this section 264 of the criminal code is the criminal harassment section. And it is a very difficult charge to approve. So our charge approval standard is whether there's a substantial likelihood of conviction and whether there's a public interest in proceeding. Well, of course, there's always a public interest when it relates to an intimate partner incident, intimate partner violence incident. But that section 264 charge can be a variety of behavior, as Amanda spoke of, and it can include that type of psychological abuse as well. But typically that occurs also in amongst other types of behavior, whether it's the repeated communication, whether it's the following around, whether it's the tracking. Typically then, if we have that often over a period of time, so that pattern of behavior, that will give us enough to approve a charge. And we don't necessarily need, it helps if there's some document proof or voice recordings, but it can just be based on her word. This is what's been happening. Well, no, you first have to get past the Crown Counsel. Okay, so the police investigate, the police take the statement and any other evidence they gather, then they forward the report to the Crown. It's the Crown Counsel's decision, first of all, whether to approve the charge or not. If we decide it doesn't meet our charge approval standard, then it goes nowhere. If we approve the charge, then it's our job to prosecute it through. And then the judge only gets involved if, in fact, the matter goes to trial, and then the judge makes a determination whether the accused is guilty or not guilty, or the judge is involved if, in fact, we're successful in getting the accused to plead guilty, and then the judge is involved in the sentencing. So you have to get through the Crown Counsel first before the charge is even before the criminal court.
What people might not know, one thing that we see in the research is that people think they have a lot more control over the process than they do. And so, you know, the victim survivor will say, I don't want to press charges. They don't understand that that's not actually something that they have control over. It's actually the police will recommend the charge. And in British Columbia, which is different than many other places across Canada, Crown then reviews the recommendation and makes a decision to either approve the charge or decline charges. So it's removed right away from that process and put in the hands of the criminal justice system. What we are unique in having here in Abbotsford is we have specialized K-file Crown. So we have 3 Crown who are dedicated to doing the intimate partner violence files, which is not something you see in most other communities. And as you can see, we work very closely with our different partners together to work through these cases. I know through having conversations with Karina in the past, they're not out to necessarily prosecute all of these cases, but to try to determine what's going on and how we can resolve the underlying issues that are resulting in violence. For some people, that might mean going to court and going through the whole process. And for others, it might mean connecting to services, counseling, whatever needs to be done at that very base level. But the other thing that we have here, that's in a few other communities across BC, are domestic violence courts. So that's where you're going to start seeing specialized judges who actually have the education, who have the training, who have the knowledge, who can start engaging in these conversations. Because without that, you get any old judge who maybe doesn't know really much about domestic violence and certainly isn't up on the current research that's happening. And so it can be a lot more difficult with these more complex cases. And there certainly are a number of cases out there to show the complexity there. I did also want to just mention one of the things, so we haven't criminalized coercive control yet in Canada, although those conversations are happening. But what we do have is in the police response to intimate partner violence, they use a tool to guide their investigation. Historically, they're looking for 19 different indicators, things like, is there a pending separation? Has there been strangulation? Is there stalking or harassment going on? In the most recent tool that was just released several months ago, police are now looking for coercive controlling behaviors. So we've recommended that they start getting some more education about coercive control, and they start to understand that intimate partner violence is not a single call for service, but often part of a larger pattern of conduct. And so they will start documenting these bigger patterns that are happening. So hopefully we're starting to build the expertise and the evidentiary collection, if that's the right phrasing to use, of these kinds of psychological, verbal power and control dynamics and tactics. So we're a long way off from where we need to be, but we are starting to build more expertise in that area.
I just wanted to add one more thing.
Yeah.
Quickly, and Corinne, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But what we tell women who say, I'm wanting to leave, but I might not have enough evidence, to prove the abuse, we do say document the sequence of events that happen in your life, like what are happening, so that if something does happen and you're ready to report, you have something to go back to. I'm not saying that might always work, but it's at least something to refresh your memory, because sometimes you forget, right? Like what happened 5 months ago, and then you're trying to explain that story is not always easy. But if you have something somewhere documented, like emails are always good, text messages, keep those, but writing in a journal is
Very
always
helpful in family court as well.
Yes, and that's the perspective I'm coming from, is what I always educate women.
Brianna, you had a question from online? How can you know if somebody's being psychologically abused? That's, again, a very difficult question to answer. But I think as we've been talking about today, a lot of those isolation, intimidation kinds of tactics are a sign that somebody might be psychologically abused, or, a history of their partner putting them down constantly. Before I turn it over to you folks to discuss, there's a really interesting program actually in the United States where they have trained people working in like hair salons. They've actually taken them through, I think it's like a 2 to 3 hour online course where they learn about domestic violence. And the reason for that is that's when a lot of the conversation comes up when a woman is getting her hair done and talking to her hairdresser. It might come up as just part of the natural part of the conversation, but also there's signs of women being coercively controlled when, they ask, okay, well, how do you want your hair done? Or do you want to try something new? And they say, my partner might not like it. I'll have to check with my partner first. These are signs that potentially there is this psychological abuse going on, that coercive controlling behaviors are present in that relationship. So it's just having those conversations and hearing something that just doesn't sound right, that should open up that conversation to find out what else is going on. But I'll turn it over to you to handle that very difficult but very important question.
Sometimes for our clients, they are focused on more of the emotional and the psychological abuse and saying, he does this or this. They have lots of different examples, right? Because again, going back to that seems to stay with you more than the physical. And they're more hurt by that. And even in court, sometimes when our clients go, they get really focused on, well, he said this, and my mother-in-law said this, and I said, they just want to tell the whole story about all this verbal abuse. And so usually with the psychological, there's that verbal abuse, the put downs, not being able to, if she dressed really nice, well, who are you dressing for? I don't care. I don't want you dressing like this. Who are you trying to impress, right? So we hear those kinds of things, but a lot of times from our clients, what we hear is the emotional abuse more so. It's a difficult one to answer because every situation is different. It's not just the physical abuse, it's not just the sexual abuse. It's all kinds of ways that they are put down. Even if they want to go back to school, that's not encouraged. I had a person who came from India. She was a professional physiotherapist, and when she got married to him, she was promised that when she got here, she can go to school. And when she got here, that was not the case. They immediately got her a job at a travel agency, and she didn't get her money. She said that no one else was working in the family. She was the only one kind of bringing the money in. And so she felt that the little bit money that she did make, it went to pay for the rent and the food. And every time she brought up the question about, well, I want to check into what credentials or what upgrades I need to do. Well, no, we can't. We can't afford the education. Then that's when the fight started. Well, why do you want to leave the house? Who are you going to go meet out there? Right? And then the fear also that if she does go out and get the education, that she may not stay. Right?
Which is why they don't want them.
So that's why.
to do it.
So it's, and I remember this young girl, and there was no physical abuse in that file, so nothing was reported to police. She showed up at our agency and met a settlement worker, and then that settlement worker called us, and she joined our support group for South Asian women who are victims of intimate partner violence. The first 3 sessions, this young girl, I think she was maybe 24, 25, she cried the whole time. The first group, she cried the whole time. She came from a family that was very much about education. Her sister was, I think, a chemical engineer in the US. She herself was a physiotherapist, and then everything in this family was not working for her, and her family was trying to support her, but they were in India. So when she joined that group, the first 3 sessions, she cried, and then she found out where to go for her education. So that group helped her connect with a lot of different resources, including education. By the end, which is 12 sessions, by the 12th session, she was smiling, she was happy, she had moved to Surrey, she had gotten her own place, and she kind of laid the law down. This is what I want. If you want to come along with me, to her husband, great. If not, I'm fine on my own in Surrey, right?
So your group helped her to get that confidence.
She got that confidence, and I remember by about the 7th session, her family sent her some money to buy a car, but she knew nobody here to share that news. And she said that she bought, like, the group is on Thursday, she bought the car on Sunday. She said, for the last 4 days, I've just been waiting for this Thursday to come around and share this news with the other girls, right, the other women in the group. It was just so powerful to see that she was getting to do what she wanted to do, and got out of that situation with some support from, I believe that she connected with SARA for Women for some things as well. So it's more of a collaborative effort when we work on these files. I can't do it alone. They can't do it alone. The police can't on the ground. In Abbotsford, we're very lucky that we all work really well together. Something that I know other communities struggle to have, but in Abbotsford, I do find that if I'm not sure about something on a case, I know I can call our Crown office. If I'm not sure something about the police, I know where to call. And a lot of times, us getting the information and the correct information to our clients is very important, especially when they finally come out, and we want to, be supported by giving them the correct information. And so I'll leave it at that.
It's a heartwarming story.
Yeah.
It's good to hear these.
I just like to
successes.
share a story. I like to share stories because it just shows that sometimes when it seems so hopeless, it does. If you can just connect with the right person, that's all they need. 1 or 2 people.
Well, having the support group around you as well, and somebody who you can talk to, who's gone through similar experiences, who validate your experiences.
And for this group that we run, which is similar to the One Love Hurt groups that's run through MCC, a lot of the clients that attend this group, they don't have a lot of family here. They don't have a lot of family that can provide that support. So, often they're stay-home moms because they have young kids, and they don't have family, they don't have friends, they're isolated. They don't know how to, some of them don't have license to drive. And so to see other women jump in to help, well, I take the bus, I'm going to show you how to do that, right? So it's really nice to see.
And I just wanted to add with transportation, like getting to groups is also a barrier for women, but you know, our agency does support women with bus tickets as well. So thank you to United Way who helps us support women, you know, and their children. But I also wanted to add what Lavinder was talking about when Love Hurts group, having it in the language that women can understand is very important. So MCC, Archway, and SARA for Women run those groups. When Love Hurts, it's an amazing group. I took that training and I didn't know some of the you know, barriers or red flags to look for. And I was like, oh, wow, you know, you can be educated in this area. You can have, you know, the knowledge and work here, but you're learning something new every day. And then with part of being the, you know, with the Violence Against Women and Intimate Relationships Committee, which our members here on this panel are a part of too, and our community partners, this is what I love about Abbotsford. We can discuss and collaborate with each other to help support women and their dependent children or anyone who's being abused. Like all walks of life, you know, if you're in addictions, we're here to support you. We meet the woman where they're at, right? So that's the beauty of this work we do.
I'll just add something. I'm just sparked in our conversations here. The Abbotsford Police Department, we have a website. There's a couple things on the website that might be kind of interesting. There was the question about what is psychological abuse. So there's scenarios where charges are not going to go ahead, or the police aren't going to be called because the person is unable to make a report to the police. But if you go to our website and go under, I think it's under crime prevention, and there's the intimate partner violence unit. In there, there's some information in there. There's actually a video on there right now. It's a YouTube video, so there's a hyperlink on there. And on there is a survivor's experience. There's one on there. There'll be a second one on there this week. And it's a snapshot of what this person went through, what helped, what didn't help, what resources were available. So certainly take a look and share that for anybody that you think might benefit from watching that. The other thing on our website, I can't recall exactly where it is, but it talks about like a go bag. So this is something all of our agencies talk about, we encourage. So maybe somebody's in a situation where they're not ready to exit the relationship, but doing a number of things such as making sure that they've maybe saved a little bit of money, they have their own credit card, they have a bag ready to go if they need to leave, with things like their passport, birth certificate, you know, those sorts of really important things.
Medication as well.
Medication,
That's one thing a lot of people forget.
Yeah. So if you have a look at our website, and there's even a Google search will give that type of information to people as well.
Yeah, it's a great story because it talks about this person who went through years of abuse, not necessarily even initially understanding that they were in an abusive relationship, and they didn't come forward to the police for many years, but they got support from a coworker actually, and started the conversation. Again, once those concerns were validated as, yes, you're in an unhealthy relationship, this is abuse, that started that connection to the various services, and in the end, they were connected to the IPV. Yeah, it's a great video.
And I think that's the important takeaway from today as well, is that educating yourself about resources, not just for yourself, but maybe someone else in your life, maybe your neighbor, maybe your friend. And I know that when our IPV unit does presentation in the school, every now and then after the presentation, I get a call at the office about my friend's mom needs help, or once we had a university student after a presentation that was done here, he encouraged his mom to seek help. So that's the important thing, is sharing the information that you learned today and passing on that knowledge to someone that might need it.
Do you have some more online questions?
It's just beautifully answered, but we can ask it to everyone. If each of us were to take one thing away today, what would it be?
That's a great question. So the question was, if we were to take one thing away from today, what would it be? So what would you recommend?
Share the information that you share and encourage and support, you know, and I think that we all have a responsibility in doing that.
You know, when we're at the farmer's market, we have community members just walking by, and we pull them in. Hey, do you know about Purple Lights? Can we tell you a little bit about it? oh, well, I'm not in an abusive relationship. Okay, but maybe you know somebody who is, or maybe you don't know somebody who is, but let's start telling you about what abusive relationships look like. And I bet you do know somebody who's experiencing some of these things. And so it is absolutely taking away, what can I do? Where can I tell them to go? Right? So sometimes you just need to be there to listen to them, to help them, to validate the concerns that they're having. If they don't know what they're experiencing as abuse, you can encourage them to think, yes, this is not how I should be treated. There's something going on here, and connect them to the various services, whether it's directly to the police or over the course of receiving those services from our community agencies. They might get to the point where they are, like in this video, where they are ready to make that formal statement and they are ready to act.
Like you said, listening, I think that when we started this presentation, we said that, it could be anybody. And sometimes women don't come forward because they say, a lot of people really like you. Who will believe me? So listening and without judgment. And I think that's really important as well. Here to support.
And what I learned in my career when I first started, was I ever proven wrong? It can happen to anyone. It doesn't matter what culture you're from, what education, knowledge. I had a doctor when I first started, and I was like, oh, this can't happen, but it can happen. It can happen to anyone, and just sharing knowledge, because there's a lot of shame sometimes that comes with it. Oh, I'm in this profession and I'm going through this. It doesn't matter. It could be anyone, and everyone's life is very important, and safety. And just helping each other. It could happen to anyone. It could be your daughter, it could be your mom, it could be your sister, your wife, right? And vice versa. And if it happens to, because we do work with all kinds of, backgrounds, it could even be a man, like maybe we need to help him connect with other resources. Like usually what we do is we do get those calls. We'll say, call Archway Services, There's groups for men as well, with the probation office they run, right? So
there's a great Abby Dad's group as well that runs through Archway, which is a support group for men. And so through our Bowweir committee, we're often seeing connections being made to the Abby Dad's group, but it's a great group. They do meetings on a regular basis and they talk through these things, some of which involve, experiences with intimate partner violence. So there are supports there for men as well. They are more limited than there are for women. We don't have shelters for intimate partner violence survivors that are males. So it is a little bit more challenging, but there are those support groups that are out there.
I think the takeaway for me is that good things can come out of reporting, whether it's report to police or whether it's report to a community agency. And the good thing that I've seen over and over again through the years is that change can happen, positive change can happen, whether the parties stay together or not. And the positive change can be, if he is the abuser, the aggressor, the one being violent, that he gets some help to address what's behind that behavior, whether it's treatment for addictions, mental health, emotional health, past trauma, and learning what a healthy relationship is and breaking that pattern that he may only know about through the programming, through Abby Dad's and through MCC and Abuses program, home improvement, or one-on-one counseling or addictions counseling, whatever it may be. And he may then be able to continue on in that relationship if she wants that to happen, of course, in a much healthier way. And they can go on to have a strong, healthy relationship. That's amazing. Or the relationship can end, but maybe there's still children. Maybe he can continue on being a good, supportive co-parent and a good father. So good things can happen. And I think a lot of women, that's a big barrier, are afraid that it's only going to blow up their world and cause a lot of problems and difficulties and hardship. And it may temporarily, but it can lead to a real better path down the road for the future.
I mean, I think you've said it before, the goal is healthy relationships, right? It's not about putting people necessarily into, the prison system and punishing them. It's addressing why they're acting violent in a way that creates healthy families in whatever shape or form they want that to be.
I think that with that, I know that when we have clients, they say, I want the charges dropped. And we start that conversation going, okay, when the police was called, there was a reason why police that call. There was something going on. Even if you want to go back, this is the opportunity to put some help in place. Because often, they don't want to go on their own. So maybe if Crown pushes a little bit, they will. And also, this might be the first time this guy is ever gonna go for, he's never been to, maybe Abbotsford, and the program that MCC runs. And I know that through the MCC program, Elsie, there are some men that attend that on their own while they're on bail, maybe, as part of their referral from maybe a bail supervisor. But I think that if, and I tell people, even if he learns 50% or it retains 10, 20%, whatever, he will walk away with something, right? So, Fran?
I was going to say too, with like maybe restorative justice with its programs, and if people come and know that that's an option and that there are people trained for it there, that may take away some of the fear of initiating the process.
Yeah. We are actually doing a research project on that right now. So I will let you know next year when the project is wrapped up. But yeah, there are certainly those models in places, again, like New Zealand, for example. Some American states are doing this. We don't have as common a practice here in British Columbia where restorative justice is used, but that doesn't mean we can't use it in some of these cases to try to resolve what's driving the violence from happening. And one of the things that can be an outcome either of restorative justice or as a pre-charge diversion tactic is to get people into the programs. Once you've completed the program, right, we might be able to stay the charges, for example, if we've gotten to that point. So it's really creating incentives for people. Yeah, right? I mean, your goal again is to create healthy families. So if you're willing to go and do the addiction treatment or go to counseling, deal with the trauma, many people who perpetrate abuse were themselves abused. And so there's underlying trauma that needs to be dealt with. So if you're willing to go and take those steps, then we might be able to stay the charge in this case. Now, of course, that is not always the best step to take. Some people, absolutely, we need to hold them accountable for their actions. But in many cases, it's about building healthy families.
Restorative justice holds you accountable.
Yes. Oh, it's more difficult in many cases.
Work out for yourself solutions
Mhm.
to restore the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. Because then you have to explain what you did. You have to, come to terms with how you've affected other people. And that can be a much more difficult process than staying mute in a courtroom would be. So there are these different approaches that we can use. And I think one of the things that is coming up to me, with your conversation today is it's a case-by-case situation. There's not just one response, right, that we should have in place. It needs to work with what the families want. We need to look at the dynamics of the relationship, how many times this has occurred, what's occurring. It's very much an individual sort of response that we need to have in place. So we need that flexibility. And thankfully with KFAL Crown, we have that. Any other questions from the audience or from online that we just have a couple minutes left? Yeah. Okay, sorry, I found the creaky spot. Where can I find the financial supports to leave an abusive relationship? This is a critical question. It came up in some of the research that we've done that people don't leave because they don't have the funds to set up a new life for themselves. So how can we help?
So I can talk to that because we help a lot of women on a daily basis with financial support. So, it's first looking at, are they eligible for income assistance? Because we work very closely with the Ministry of Income Assistance Development. If it's not that they're not eligible, okay, well, they have to pay their rent and they're behind, because that's always another thing. How can I pay my rent? I had to buy groceries, right? So with rent, we're connected. We work with collaboratively with Northview Church, with MCC, they have the rent bank. We also have housing subsidies that we at SARA for Women also are able to provide. We connect with Archway's housing prevention worker. We also connect with Salvation Army, with Lookout, to help get subsidies for women to support them in housing. And we also do housing applications, BC housing applications with women, rental assistance. A lot of people don't know what rental assistance is. So we'll help the woman go through that. So when it comes to financials, there's always a way. It might not be the ideal situation at that time, but it's going to be something to make you, to support you get through that situation, whether it's, you're experiencing homelessness or domestic violence, So.
And the other thing with when you're renting, people, there's an incident, he gets arrested, he's no longer living at the house, but she can't afford to pay the rent. And then the fear of some of our clients say, well, but we signed a lease But BC, the landlord tenancy has a clause in there if you're a victim of intimate partner violence, they can get out of that lease without having to pay. So not often, but once in a while, we get a situation where we give a letter to our client saying, here's a letter saying, yes, she is victim of intimate violence, so that the landlord can't come after the rent from her, so that she can maybe find another place that she's able to afford.
Did you mention the crime victim assistance program
No,
earlier
I
as well?
didn't, I should. So crime victim assistance is a program, a provincial program where our clients can apply for counseling fees and among other things, but mostly it's for counseling. And they will pay for private counseling if the client needs that, and the kids as well. Sometimes if they have kids, I think over three and over, we cover the kids under family member application. So we assist in our clients in applying for crime victim assistance. They are taking a long time, but there are some counselors in the community sometimes will take people on and wait, but very limited number of those counselors. I'm hoping they will improve their backlog because it has become a huge barrier in some ways. Yes, they can apply, but they're taking a long time. And we're having those discussions with them to see, because right now it's taking 6 to 8 months at least to get approval. So that is something that the clients can apply for. Things like if they need a security system to manage their safety, sometimes they can also apply for the cost of that to see that and get reimbursed.
And cell phones, I know, be given out as well.
Yes,
as a
cell
resource.
phones, things especially on our high-risk files.
One other thing I might just quickly add for finances is if a person is comfortable, reach out to friends, reach out to family, reach out to people that you respect in the community, your church, maybe your teacher, maybe your boss or your coworker. Share what details you feel comfortable, and maybe they can help you brainstorm ways of coming up with finances, or maybe somebody can assist you.
And I also wanted to add, like, budgeting, that's also another thing our outreach team can help the women with, is budgeting, and if it comes to food, we help them connect them to the resources in the community, like the food bank, or I know that the churches also offer like lunches that they're able to prepare, like hampers, and then also clothing. We get donations. We have wonderful donors that donate to our agencies that we can support clothing with. And I wanted to mention with Frania, which is our great boutique, if a woman needs to go to a job and she's found a job, it doesn't have that dress right for that, we've been able to help women with that as well, just to get out there for her confidence and training, how can I use a cashier if they want to even get a job, right? Like at a store. So there's wonderful services in the community, and we all work together to help each other. So that's
The resources are there. We just need to connect people into them. So I'll give you the last question. Okay.
Adding to the food, there's an organization called the Gathering Market,
oh yes,
and they do food meal kits for $5 that will feed a family. So you get the dignity of being able to buy your own food, and yet it's they did use rescue food for that.
That's great. That's
at Cascade Church on Salvation Army on Delaro. Yes,
Yes.
I met that lovely woman at an event. She was like, I'm very busy, and I need that support. So great program.
Yeah, she's doing amazing work.
Yeah, I think she started on herself too, I think, in that journey. So
We've run out of time. I'm so glad that this conversation was so active, and I apologize to anybody online who didn't get their question answered. And anybody here, you have the opportunity, once we wrap up our event, please, feel free to speak to our panelists. We also have some amazing volunteers from SARA for Women, Archway Victim Services. They're out at our tables. We'll also be at the farmer's market this Saturday in Abbotsford with our table. You'll see our booth there all lit up. So please feel free to come and visit us, ask those questions, grab those resources, get your stickers and buttons, and learn about the other resources that are available in the community. So with that, thank you very much for attending in person, attending online. I hope you've learned a lot about what we have available here in Abbotsford, and I hope you continue to learn and reach out and develop your awareness about these these resources that we have. So thank you so much. And I do have some gifts for you, but I'll just turn off the camera first, and then I'll give you the token of appreciation, and then feel free, please, to come and speak with our panelists. Thank you, everybody.